On January 13, 1982, amidst a severe snowstorm, Air Florida Flight 90 departed Washington National Airport destined for Fort Lauderdale. Shortly after its takeoff, the Boeing 737 failed to gain altitude, crashing into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. At the same time, a redline metro train derailed, tasking emergency responders to their limits. On the fire radio that day on Channel 1 was none other than Steve Souder. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with Steve to recapture the events of that day in real time from someone who was actually there. So I hope you enjoy this little bit of preserved history for 911. Hey, it's Fletcher. I'm Vice President of Public Safety Solutions at 911 Inform. And today I'm sitting down with a very good friend of mine, a very old friend of mine, who's been in this 911 business for more years than I've been alive, believe it or not, and I'm an old fart. Of course, we're talking about Steve Souder, who's currently part of the Maryland State 911 Board, but has got his feet firmly planted into public safety since, get this, 1954. Steve, it's such a pleasure to have you here, as always. It's been a while since we sat down for a podcast.
Yes, it has. I remember the last time we did it, and I believe it was in, maybe Arizona or someplace like that. An APCO-NENA conference of some kind somewhere.
I do remember that one. Absolutely. Now, we've sat down about probably 4 or 5 times over the years. Carly Anderson, I think, first brought us together for a podcast after one of the 911, Next Gen 911 Institute, where we interviewed a bunch of folks down there. I remember you were in your office. I was up here in New Jersey, but that was the first time we ever spoke.
Yeah, and you mentioned Carla's name. What a great human being. I just love that woman. She is just incredible. And I think about her every July when the anniversary comes for her very, very untimely passing.
Now, she did a lot of great things for this industry. I can't imagine where we would be if she were still here driving this in the background. It's just, I think about that often on how much we missed because she's not here. But, so be it. Her memory lives on. I know there are a lot of people that still bring out that event every year. And of course, she's firmly planted still in the Institute board, Next Gen 911 Institute board with the, the annual award that they give out in her honor. And, that's.
And I was, if I might add, I was honored to be the recipient of that award on the first year that award was awarded. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Hank Hunt won that award. I got to present to him that one year, and a lot of distinguished people have won that award. But
and
we're
I
here
to add too one last thing, that it's not an award that they give it annually just to give it annually. I think that it's given when they believe there are candidates that are worthy of it, and if any given year or two no one kind of fits that bill, they just pass on and wait their time.
You know what? I've being on that board now, I know as well as you do, there are times I said, does anybody deserve this? There have been times where it's like, some people were close, but you know what? No. And that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, fantastic. But we're here today to talk about you, and we're talking about a specific date in your history, and that is January 13th. Being the day down in the Metro Washington area. And, disasters follow you, Steve. Many people are glad you retired because disasters seem to follow you. And I'd like to talk about, for those who don't know, or at least to preserve the memory, when did you start and what was the first disaster that followed you?
Well, I guess the most notable one, and probably even greater than the event that we're going to highlight today, was the first day that I actually took a position on light duty because of an injury I had incurred in the fire service. And I took that light duty position at the Communications Division of the District of Columbia Fire Department. And that date will forever live in my mind because it was April 4th of 1968, a date that many people may not immediately recognize, uh, but it was the date at which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. I arrived at my light duty position 2 hours early, typical fireman. And because I did, the chief operator who was running the shift at that time asked around the room who was first in that morning. And the first in person happened to be the person on the radio. So he raised his hand. Kenny Helton was his name. And the chief operator says, Kenny, you believe Souder, you take the radio. Now, I had never been on the radio in my life before. But I sat down there and I wasn't uncomfortable because being in the fire service and being in the fire department, I was kind of keenly aware of, the jargon, the routine, the protocols, the methodology that DC Fire Communications operated under. So I wasn't really, out of the loop, but never did I expect to be on the radio on day one. And that was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We worked 8-hour shifts back then. And eventually the whole crew was on duty at 4 o'clock. And it was a routine evening, nothing exceptional. We had the news on. And then out of Memphis, Tennessee came the word that Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And a silence came over the communications room. There were only 7 of us on duty. And we all looked at each other, and it was just like disbelief. Now, the public should know that in the months and the years leading up to Dr. King's assassination, there was a lot of racial turmoil in the country. And there had been civil disturbances, riots, if you will, elsewhere in the country as people expressed their strong beliefs. But we couldn't help but wonder, now that this severity of an event had occurred, what might that lead to? But we just kind of pondered and watched the news, and then at about 10:30 that evening, just prior to getting ready to be relieved at midnight, uh, had a dumpster fire in an area that was always known to be a very incendiary, socially speaking, incendiary area. And we all looked around and looked at that and just wondered, I wonder what this means. But we dispatched and they extinguished it, and then another one popped up and the same thing. But in rapid order, it seemed to, by nature of the time of day, to kind of tamper down. And everybody was relieved. And I was a little bit uncomfortable leaving the building. And I wasn't uncomfortable for my safety, but I was uncomfortable because I just did not know what might happen. And I did not want to not be able, to get to work the next day. So I asked if I could and was given permission to stay in the building and sleep. And I did on the floor. And I was up bright and early the next morning, and things were rather calm. And they asked me to be on the radio again that day. And as events unfolded, and they began to unfold very rapidly, with a fire here and a fire there, and assaults on firefighters, fire trucks, incendiary bombs, et cetera, et cetera. And things began to really unwind very, very rapidly. So to answer your question, that is a day, my first day on the job, including the second day and days that followed, that really, and some people have said it was my baptism of fire, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But that was a day and a series of days that ran into weeks. It was actually a total of 3 weeks before things really became under control. So a long way of saying to you, Fletch, that January 13th of 1982 was a big important day, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But an even bigger day was the riots of April 4th and beyond in 1968.
And unfortunately, I mean, most people will have an event like that in their career somewhere. Anyone that's been, long term in public safety will have a day that had a significant event. But significant events seem to follow you with several in the DC area.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Uh, After I retired from the District of Columbia Fire Department, I went to work for the Arlington County government as their first 911 director and their first combined consolidated communications center, and that was an exciting position. And I spent 16 years there. And just as my career was winding down there, because I had decided to accept another position. Lo and behold, September 11th of 2001 occurred, and I was right there. I was getting my necktie on to go to the event on Capitol Hill that had been assembled by Nina to have a formal presentation of a document they had been working on for several years, having to do with the state of 911 in America and what is the next generation of 911 going to look like. And some real legendary people within NINA and the industry contributed so much to that document. And here we are many years after the fact, and pretty much everything that they predicted, pretty much everything they recommended is in fact the foundation of next generation as we now know it. But my point being, I guess, as I was winding down my career in Arlington County, lo and behold, I found myself in the midst of the 9/11 event, and particularly the attack on the Pentagon, which was about a mile from our 911 center in Arlington. You may have been there. I think Fletch and certainly others visited. But because I might add that there were so many luminaries in D.C. on that day, because had been invited to this event, when the event occurred, meaning that when the attack on the Pentagon occurred, all these people immediately did what public safety people want to do. They wanted to help. They wanted to be involved. And my phone at work was ringing off the hook, and was everybody imaginable that had been down at the Capitol building, because they were there and I didn't get there, wanting to know if they could come over and help answer phones. Well, it would have been interesting if that had been possible to do. For them just to get out of downtown and over to where we were would have been virtually impossible. But a fun event. And then I want to just take it 1 year further, if you don't mind. I mentioned that I was winding down my 16-year career in Arlington and had accepted a position of the 911 director in Montgomery County, Maryland. And that's where my family and I raised our children. And the 911 center was only a short distance from our home, and my wife had just been diagnosed with a very serious illness. So you put all those dots together, and it just seemed that I was being called closer to home. And I went there, and I had only been there a matter of less than a year. And what happens? By and behold, it is the Beltway sniper, uh, to which had its origins in Montgomery County, with a huge impact on 911, and another elongated event that lasted for 3 agonizing weeks, and multiple deaths, and just a tragedy upon tragedy. But your point is, Mark, that some people may not be fortunate to have major events in their career. I've been doubly fortunate, triply fortunate, and beyond to have many. And that's why this invitation from you to me today to chat about the events of January 13th, I am really grateful for, because as I grow older and people of my generation grow older, some of this history, which was not captured by cell phone video and instant recordings that would easily be achieved today, but have to rely upon people that were there, people that have that recollection. And I'm fortunate to be one of those people. And I really feel I feel an obligation, compelled, if you will, to kind of tell my story, not because it's my story, but because it's a story that the generations that have followed me can perhaps learn from as they, go through their career and handle their share of disasters in whatever field of 911 and public safety and first responder they may be.
Yeah, Steve, if there's a definition of a mentor in this industry, I'm going to have to say it's you. You certainly have been a mentor of mine for many, many years. Just calm, steadfast, well educated, understanding. I mean, there's not enough adjectives to define your participation in this industry. And again, January 13th is one that, again, disaster follows you. You've had direct impact. And I don't mean to laugh out of disrespect for the events, because each of these events involved people dying, unfortunately. And I'm laughing at the irony of you being at the center of all of these different events. And again, tell us about January 13th.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Fletch. Yes, you've been a longtime friend. And let me thank 911 Informs, who's been a new name in my world. But let me thank each of you, both of you, for taking the initiative to do what you're doing, not just today, not just this interview, but the many other things that you are doing in the industry to help the industry and the people that are in the industry. So uh, thank you personally on my behalf. And I think in so doing, I'm doing it on many other people's behalf that don't have the opportunity to offer that appreciation. Uh, January 13th was a Monday, uh, and uh, I was off the day before, and uh, I was home, and weather had been predicted to be bad, so I went to bed fairly early at my home in the small community of Montgomery Village, Maryland, and I told my wife I'd be getting up earlier than usual to get to work, not knowing what the weather might be as this weather was coming in. And at about 2:30 in the morning, the phone rang, and I was tempted to say cell phone. We did not have cell phones back then. We did not have any of the technologies that we now take so much for granted. But the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was work. And they said, Steve, I know you're coming in this morning. Normally, we need you to come in early. There's a major fire at a vacant hospital building that coincidentally happened to be in the same uh, district that I was assigned to when I was in the firefighting division. So I knew the building well. And they said, we need you to come in here because things are really popping. So I said, okay, and got out of bed, into clothes, no shower, no shave, no nothing, and went down to my car, and it had been covered with snow. I gave a quick brush off, and off I went, and I was in the District of Columbia probably 25 minutes later. Being an old fire guy, if you will, I couldn't be that close to the fire, so I had to swing by the fire on my way to the communication center just to see what was going on, and it was rocking. And the boys and the girls were mainly boys back then, but the guys had their hands full. So anyhow, I swung by the block and then went into the communication center, which was just a short distance away, and walked in the door. And they said, "Guess what? Take the radio." Here we go again. So I did that, and eventually the fire got under control. The fire department had invoked a plan that was called Plan F, and it was the name for when they recall off-duty people back to work for whatever reasons. So because the department was so depleted in manpower because of this big fire, they invoked this Plan F. So there were other guys coming to work early to staff reserve apparatus and things of that nature to take the place of those that were on the fire ground. But anyhow, dawn arrived and there was a formal exchange of shifts. Some people that had been there earlier than me, because it was the night shift they were on, they went home. I didn't because I was doing that morning, so I stayed. And and the day was pretty busy. Nothing spectacular, but it was rocking. I mean, it was a lot of fire activity. The storm was getting worse. The snow was building up, and I could not help but wonder as the afternoon approached whether or not I was even going to get home that night because of the weather. Uh, but at any rate, at about 4 o'clock, and 2 hours earlier than what would normally be the case, uh, the night shift began to come in early because that's the way it is if you're in the fire service. You come in early, you get relieved early. So they came in, and I was relieved on the radio, and I had not eaten anything all day, and boy was I hungry. But at any rate, shortly thereafter, into the communications room, there came a battalion chief, a dear friend of mine, fellow academy member with me, by the name of McElden Fleming. And Mac and I went back a number of years, and he said, I just thought I'd stop by on my way home. He lived in a community in Montgomery County called Wheaton, Maryland. So I said, well, that's good. Thank you. He says, what are you doing? I said, well, I think I'm going to hang back before I head home. And, but I'm going to go over and I'm going to get a sandwich at a local fast food place that has some really good roast beef sandwiches. And he said, hold on, well, don't go dust your car off just for that. He says, I'll run you over. So we went out of the building and went the half a dozen blocks or so over to this restaurant, which had the unique name of Roy Rogers. And some people of my generation may know that name. It was a very popular restaurant in the Middle Eastern part of the country. And at one point in time, I think was a part of the Marriott chain. But at any rate, we went over and I figured, well, I'm here. I'm going to get two sandwiches. So I got two sandwiches. They wrapped them nice in tinfoil, and I came back out of the restaurant. Mac was waiting. Hopped in the car. Back to the communication center we went. He dropped me off at the front curb. He did a U-turn and headed home. I walked up the steps, and as I walked through the door, the box alarm was being sounded for the report that had been received about the crash of what we now know to be Air Florida Flight 90. And I think, Mark, I don't know how you're going to compose this video and interview, but there is a great segment of the audio tape on that depicts um verbatim the way that call was received. And I'm going to explain it to the audience, if you don't mind, because today, if an event like that occurred, there would be thousands upon thousands of 911 calls reporting a plane crash onto the 14th Street Bridge in the midst of a snowstorm. That particular afternoon at 16:01, there was one phone call, only one, and and it was from what back then was called a mobile telephone operator. And if you were a person of means or of importance, and remember that Washington, D.C. had a lot of important people in it, many of those people had mobile telephones. And they could not just pick up their phone and call somebody. They had to go through the mobile telephone operator and tell them who they wanted to call and give them the number. The mobile telephone operator would actually call the number, and then once he had the party on the line, he would patch the person that had been called to the person that was making the call in the car, and they would talk, and the mobile telephone operator would drop off. That's kind of the way it went. It was kind of a clunky early version of mobile communications, but all of these clunky versions are stepping stones in a long journey of the improvement of communications in general, and not just in public safety. But at any rate, the phone call, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody. I'm going to let you, Mark, find that segment and put it into this audio because it's extraordinarily interesting. So I'm going to leave it at that. But nevertheless, we got one phone call reporting that event, and the chief operator that was on duty, immediately recognizing the severity of the event being reported, sounded the alarm, broadcast the alarm that I walked into the room hearing at the very time it was being broadcast. Uh, and right away, you knew this was no hoax alarm. This was the real deal, and you knew you had on your hands, or there was unfolding a major event. Uh, so I went over to the chief operator and I says, "Hey, it's me. I'm back. I'm here to help you. Just tell me what you need done." And he said, "Go over to the radio, which is where I had been all day, and just see if you can provide any help there." So I went over to the radio, and Denise was her name on the radio, and she was pretty good, very good, in fact. And I said, "Denise, I'm back. Tell me what I can do to help you." And we had a little procedure back in the day that was called typing and talking. One person would talk, and the other person would enter data, so that the talker didn't have the need to enter into the keyboard everything that was being said as well. So I says, "I'll be glad to type for you." And she said, "Yeah, do that." So I was typing as she was talking, and and then, and you may pick up this too on the audio tape, Fletch. Uh, at some point in time, she says, I'd feel better if you took over the radio." And I didn't want to be intrusive in any way, shape, or form. I said, "You sure you want? You're doing a great job." She says, "No, I really would. I'd feel better if you took it over. This is too important." I said, "Okay." So we swapped over, and then I became the talker, and she was doing the typing. And then it became real evident that we had a mess on our hands. And picture this, if you will, where this event occurred, and enough of the attendees to your podcast have probably been in the nation's capital often enough to be familiar with some of the historic landmarks. We get the 14th Street bridges, and I say bridges plural because there's a number of them, but all clustered together. You certainly know where Reagan National Airport is, back then called National Airport. The Potomac River, and all the landmarks. But one thing you may not know is that the District of Columbia boundaries end on the Virginia shoreline. So the Potomac River, if you will, is owned by DC and not Arlington. And this plane hit the bridge at about 50 yards uh, outside of the boundary line between DC and Virginia. So it was clearly Washington's incident. That's not to say that Arlington didn't go, and I'll get into that in a minute, but it was Washington's incident. And as units began to arrive, they had to get there. First of all, it was a long run in horrendous traffic because this storm had caused a lot of the federal employees to be released from work early. Um, and because they were released from work early, they made a beeline to go home. But normally, when they're released from work at normal hours, the traffic flow pattern of the traffic lights is automatically changed so that they have, in many ways, a much smoother exodus of the city. Well, in this case, because it was released early and they didn't change the traffic lights, uh, traffic was a mess. First of all, you had 8 to 10 to 12 inches of snow everywhere you looked, depending upon where you were. Now you had all of this traffic out there in gridlock, and you've got this major transportation crash event. And the units that or even the first due units due at the crash are themselves far away. This is not like your neighborhood fire station is at the end of the bridge. There's a long distance between the first due company and where that crash site was. So it took a long time for apparatus to get there for those various reasons that I'm talking about. Uh, but they eventually did get there, and they had a mess on their hands. What had happened is the plane was attempting to ascend. The weight of the ice that had built up on its wings because of the snow was causing it to drop. And I'm going to try and give you a kind of a visual here. The plane is attempting to elevate that way, but the weight of the snow is pulling it down this way. And by the time it gets to the 14th Street Bridge, which is this end, it hits the bridge. Uh, there were, I think it was 7 cars on the bridge that were struck. Uh, 4 occupants of the cars were decapitated. The roofs sheared right off of the vehicles. They proverbially never knew what hit them. The plane then went to the other side of the bridge, meaning the other lane, and off into the Potomac River, which was below and ice clogged. So I would suggest to you that uh, today's movie producer director could not conjure up a better set of circumstances insofar as elements of a tragedy than occurred at that day. You have the snow, you have the crash, you have the cars, you have the ice clogged river, you have the difficulty getting to it, you name it. And it was a mess. But sooner or later, DC got to where the cars were, and Arlington is at the other end of the bridge, kind of standing by at their borderline between D.C. and Virginia. And back then, we did not enjoy, and I say enjoy, we did not enjoy the level of automatic response and automatic resource sharing that we do today. The fire departments were very parochial. You handle your fires, I'll handle my fires. You don't come into my town until I want you to come into my town. All of that, age old thinking, that's all gone bye bye, and largely because of this event. So it was one of the very, very major positive outcomes that came of the event, because that parochial, borderline, you don't come into me, I don't go into you, went away. It went away in a hurry. And now there is automatic aid in many, many cases that doesn't even need a phone call. It's all programmed into the CAD system, and an event could, in fact, have jurisdiction or units responding from 3 or 4 jurisdictions. It's that smooth today, but it wasn't back then. So when the units actually got to the scene, there quite frankly, sadly, wasn't much to do. But what they found was 5 passengers and crew members that had been tossed from the airplane on impact. Now, their fellow travelers, they didn't have that luxury. They were still tied to their seats, and there was no getting out. These 5 somehow were thrown out as the plane split open, and how now they are in this icy clogged river, with these fire engines parked at the rail, looking down at them and not really having any ability to help them. But then, not a short distance away, there was housed the United States Park Police helicopter, which is titled Eagle One. It was then, it is now. Not the same aircraft, but the same title. And they heard of the event as well, and they scurried to launch, having to clear off the runway and tow the helicopter out to the pad from its shelter, but they nevertheless got airborne, and because they were relatively close, they were on the scene in a hurry. And there were two guys in that helicopter. The pilot was a guy who I've come to know by the name of Don Usher. Don was the guy, at the controls, and his partner that day. And I'll think about that name in just a minute. Excuse me, but he was the guy that you will famously remember leaning out the door of the helicopter, standing on the skids of the helicopter, and throwing this rope or trying to help people that were in the Potomac River immersed in ice onto the helicopter. And you might recall that in most cases they didn't make it, meaning that they slid off, they didn't have the strength. Hypothermia was setting in very quickly. So it was an ugly scene. And then amongst the many cars that were, immediately drawn to a halt because of all of this, there sat a young man who worked for the federal government, and his name has become synonymous locally by the name of Lenny Slutnik. And Lenny is that guy that you may remember who took off his coat and took off his shirt and brazenly dove into the Potomac River, dove in and swam out to these people that were struggling to grab a hold of a life preserver, which was being dangled from the helicopter at the end of a rope. Uh, this was 43 years ago. So if you can imagine something like that happen today and how much more sophisticated an event like that, a rescue effort like that would be with all of the technology that we have today. But that's all they had, a life preserver and a rope. And two guys that uh, are just heroes in their own right. Um, uh, I can't say enough about them. I can't say enough about them. Uh, and Don is still alive, and he's now retired. I had the pleasure of being in this company a couple of years ago, and it was humbling to be with a guy that was that skilled and that brave and that cool, calm, and collected that day. But anyhow, again, and I don't want to capitalize this whole event with my verbal recollections, because there is, Fletch, a lot of audio tape that if you're lucky to be able to kind of find it and piece it together, that I think is good supplemental stuff to what I'm saying, because it gives a visual context to just my spoken word. But at any rate, one of the things that was immediately evident to me was the fact that this was not a well organized event from the standpoint of the first responders. Uh, Everybody was well intended. Oh my gosh. Everybody was doing their best, absolutely. But there were only two radio channels on which to communicate. There was only two chiefs to manage this entire huge event. There was no ability to talk to any of the units on the Arlington side of the bridge. So we, the District of Columbia Fire Department, was very handicapped by nature of not having those things in place. Uh, and they really became a real hindrance throughout the entire event, the whole thing that we commonly call communications. And there's hardly ever an event that I've heard or read about that is major that communications isn't identified after the fact as being a problem area. So to everybody that's on this podcast, most of which of you are in communications, thank you for what you do, and you got your work ahead of you. Still, we're nowhere near where we need to be, but we're certainly way further along than we were that afternoon on January 13th, 1982. Uh, but because there was none of this and only two radio channels, there was an awful lot of one unit talking over the other unit, command was very challenging in order to communicate with their officers, and it was a cluster. It was a cluster, and you know what I mean. But not because there was not good intent. It was a cluster because we didn't have the tools to work with. Uh, I'm going to kind of transition now, if you don't mind, from where we are in this conversation to something that happened 30 minutes into the incident. 30 minutes into the incident, and uh, less than a half a mile away. 30 minutes and one half a mile away. Guess what happened? About 60 feet below ground, underneath the Washington, D.C. Mall, at two metro rail stations called the Smithsonian Station and the Federal Triangle Station, there were two trains that were absolutely packed with people. People, in most cases, federal employees that were using Metro to get to and from work. They also had been released. So they got their coat and hat and went down into the station and down the escalator and onto the platform and waited for the trains to come. And they came. But at some point in time, and I don't know that much about train jargon nor operations, but there was a need to do some movement of a crossover track arrangement to take a train from one track to another track. And this was being monitored and was being supervised and all of that. But in the midst of all of that, there was a crash of the train against a pillar, a concrete pillar in the wall of the tunnel. And it just messed things up really bad below ground. It ended up that 3 people were killed in the subway train. And now we have a half a mile from the airplane crash, a train crash. And as I said earlier, it would be hard put for a Hollywood producer to conjure up a series of events that were this complex and challenging. But that's what we were dealt with that day. And added to that was the fact that back then Metro was fairly young, and it did not have any antennae system within the Metro system that allowed for public safety that might be in the system to, on their portable radios, communicate above ground and into the communication center or the incident commander. Excuse me again, I need a sip of water here. So again, Fletch, I would invite you to try and look at that audio or listen to that audio, because the exchange and the dispatch of the metro train crash is pretty exceptional in itself. So the way that worked, once the units arrived on the scene, and we sent units to both ends of that section of track, one to one station, 4 engine companies, 2 trucks, a rescue squad, and the same complement to the other, several blocks away, and then they worked towards the event until they came up upon it. So the way that worked is that somebody below ground on a portable radio would get on a telephone that was called the blue light station. And for your audience, that the next time they're in DC and if they're on Metro, look out the window as you go through the tubes, and about every 100 feet you'll see a blue light, blue light, blue light, blue light. And what those blue lights are wired telephones, and they're in a cabinet, but they're hardwired and as a means of communicating the elongated portion of the phone of the tunnel. So somebody that's on the scene will take the incident, or take the officer in charge of a particular engine company. He goes to the blue light station. He picks up the phone. Okay, it goes to uh, Metro Control Center, commonly called the Rock, and then it gets filtered back eventually to come up above ground. And there'd be somebody up there from the fire department that would take the blue light message, and they'd on the radio broadcast it to the communications center. So it was really it was the best we could do back then, and not just on this incident. It was the best we could do back then, technology wise. Uh, so cellular communications and all of that was non-existent. So we had to do what we had to do with the tools that we were given, and make do without the tools we didn't have. But we did that, and we were able to manage that incident two at the same time. Pretty interesting, pretty challenging, pretty rewarding, quite honestly, because when you're able to kind of bring a little bit of calm to naturally historic, chaotic event, it's a good feeling. It's a good feeling. Uh, but again, that event, the train event, created another whole wave of technology improvements and procedural improvements, so that it has matured over the years, and today it's very smooth, very flawless, and very good, if you will, reliable. Uh, and it really, the time went by so quickly. I guess it was so quick, and the whole thing took about 5 hours before we got things really under control. Uh, but I was just very honored to be there, and to have a small role in a very historic uh, event. Uh, and I'm going to take a quick break here, uh, Fletch, and just ask if you have any questions of me, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Well, Steve, I mean, technology has advanced considerably. Um, and I wonder if you think that the lack of technology kept that incident down to where it was manageable. I can't imagine if the density of cellular phones that exists today had existed then, the unintentional DDoS attack or TDOS attack that would have created on the local 911 centers. You could have taken almost everything out of service. You got thousands of people involved in those incidents.
Well, Fletch, I never thought about it quite in that context, but I think you're spot on in your observation. Uh, and that leads me to another facet of the whole issue of communications. As I mentioned at the outset, back in the day, 1983, 43 years ago, 82, excuse me, 43 years ago, we didn't have many portable radios. Only the chief and his aide carried it. They were clunkers. They were only two channel. Their range wasn't very great, and it was a mess. And back then, 800 megahertz, 700 megahertz radio channels were unheard of. No one even knew what that meant. So we were all UHF and VHF radio channels. Uh, and not surprisingly, after the event, the Congress held hearings. And they held hearings because of a couple of things. First of all, it was in our collective backyard. They genuinely wanted to learn what we could do better. And after the fact, I got a phone call from the fire chief in District of Columbia, who was somebody that I had known for a number of years. And he said, Steve, the Congress is going to hold hearings on Air Florida, and they want me to come and testify. And I said, well, that's good, Chief. And he said, I don't think so. He said, I would rather have you go because you were there. No one can describe to the Congress what we were encountering that day than you. And I said, Chief, man, I'm just a firefighter. He says, that's okay. I want you to go and represent me. And I said, okay, Chief. So the date and the time is arrived at, and I put on my Class A uniform, which you usually only do for promotions and funerals. And off to the Capitol I went. And I found my way through the maze of hallways and corridors and you name it, and found myself at the hearing room, and walked in and was appropriately seated, and there was that typical, as you see on the news, that array of microphones in front of you. So I sat down, and sooner or later, the members of the Congress came in. I think it was the Senate. And they sat down and they were chatting amongst themselves. And then the chairman brought the gavel down and the hearing began. And there I am at the table with all these microphones, and wondering how in the hell am I going to get through this. uh, and I knew a lot rested on it. But at any rate, they began their conversations, and the senator that was chairing the meeting was just an extraordinarily wonderful human being. Was Chairman Inouye of the state of California, now deceased. You might remember him. He was a World War II hero that had lost his arm in World War II. But at any rate, he chaired it, and he must have sensed the nervousness that I think I probably demonstrated. And he said to me, words to the effect, Mr. Souder, welcome to the committee. We are really glad you're here. Tell me a little bit about you and your family. And it was his very, very gentle way of releasing a little bit of stress that I may have had, having never done this before. But the important thing, I guess, afterwards, that during the course of the hearings, the bottom line was they wanted to know why we couldn't communicate better. And I explained to them the UHF and the VHF, and I explained to them by putting it in the context of a tube of bologna, how when the bologna was sliced up, if that bologna was in fact the spectrum that we talked about, some people got thicker pieces of bologna and some people got thinner pieces, and the railroads got this, and telecommunications got that, and police got that, and park rangers got that. So when it came down to fire departments and police departments, there wasn't much left, and what we got was called UHF and VHF, thin slices, not a whole lot of spectrum there. And that today's day and age required much, much more than that. And because we didn't have much more than that, was at the root cause of our communications challenge, our inability to communicate with each other, uh, both distance as well as in more one-on-one conversations, rather than have everything go through one particular command post. Uh, and we'll talk about that in a minute because I didn't mention that, and I think that's another important facet. But at any rate, I'm explaining this to him, and I really do think that he's getting it. And I was really pleased to see the smile on his face and the nod that he gave. Uh, and he said, Steve, what can we do right now? What can we do to help you? And I said, well, Senator, I think you need to get in touch with the FCC, because my understanding is that there is spectrum available that has never been used and that can be reallocated to first responders, fire rescue, police, that will go a long way towards relieving this congestion. He says, oh, he says, well, I'll be happy to call the FCC when the hearing is over. And now I'm really feeling good, right? And I said, but that's only half of it, because what we then need, we need portable radios that are not as limiting as our VHF and UHF portable radios were. and that had more channel capacity built into them. He says, well, I can't help you there. And I understand that completely. But the point is that of all the many, many takeaways from that event, and there were many, many, but that was one of the greatest. The takeaway that public safety had been granted the use of 800 megahertz spectrum, and the industry were put on notice by a challenge. Now you have a new market, but you need to produce a product that's going to work within that market. So they immediately went to work, and at that time there were two major radio manufacturers. One of them is still a major manufacturer, and they produce radios that were able to use these new capacity channels and technology that went with it, commonly called trunking, that most people on this call will be familiar with. So it was a huge step forward, uh, yeah, that came out of that hearing. And sure enough, to Senator Inouye's promise, within 6 months, the FCC had opened up the spectrum for public safety to use, and boy, was public safety happy about that. Which leads me to one final thing that I want to mention, and it's kind of humorous. Uh, the FCC had made the announcement that they were going to release the spectrum, and back then, nothing online. Now you had to get paper forms and fill them out with a typewriter and a pen. But nevertheless, DC did that. DC Fire Department did that, and they put down what they had, they put down what they needed, they put down whatever they were going to do to justify the need, and so on and so on. And then it said you needed to put this in the mail and get it to the FCC by a date specific. And the phone rings again at headquarters, which is where I was working, and it's my friend, the fire chief again. He says, Steve, he says, we've got all this forms filled out. He says, we think we got it right, but we're not trusting in the mail to get it there on time. We want you to deliver it, hand deliver it. So I said, no problem. What day does it have to be delivered by? And it gave me the date, and I looked at it and said, well, I'm working that day. No problem. I'll stop by early on my way to work. And the communications center was not that far from the FCC headquarters. Um, so anyhow, I got up early again, got downtown again, parked my vehicle at the nearby firehouse, walked 3 or 4 blocks to the FCC building. And when I got there, what I was greeted by was a line of people that completely encircled the building, all of them with big brown envelopes in their hand.
Hmm.
And these were the public safety agencies from across the nation who, just like Washington, D.C., and everything in between, were in dire need of more spectrum. And they also did not want to trust it to the mail. They wanted to bring it there and have it stamped by somebody that it was received on the date specific. And and I got in the back of the line, and the line continued to grow. But sooner or later, my turn was there, and they put the stamp on it, and they gave me a receipt, and I went back and got my car and went to work. And there are many, many facets of this event, this day, that right now I don't have time to describe, but I think you and your audience can get a pretty good idea of what was going on. Uh, and Sad, tragic it was. 81 souls lost their lives that day. And no one should ever lose their life in an event like this, and without there being some redeeming benefit come of it over time. And each of them can take uh, pride in the fact that their untimely death, tragic as it was, nevertheless brought about immense change throughout America. And America is a better place today from a public safety communication standpoint uh, because of their death. So, Fletch, I'm going to take a break again and turn it back to you, friend.
Steve, it's a fantastic story that I've heard in various different formats over the years. I don't believe I've ever had such a comprehensive representation of that day with the detail and more so the impact of that day on the industry as we know it. And, you and I met and have worked and collaborated for, oh God, too many years now. And it's all been around standards work. It's all been around best practices. And sometimes the workload gets a little monotonous. There's a lot to do. And you sit back and you wonder, is any good going to come from this? But then you have events like this that you can sit back and, because of you, can memorialize those events and maybe bring up things that have been forgotten because of the lack of social media and the lack of the world documenting the world. It's important for people like yourself who were there, who did things, who participated in these things, to bring that memory forward. And I feel like it's part of my job to be able to record them today and provide that preserved documentation, if you will, of our history that is going to be lost if we're not careful. So thank you for all of your hard work in the industry, not just for the things that you've done, but also for your preservation of public safety history. Um, it's a contribution that I kind of always knew that was there, but just realized just now the gravity and the importance of people like yourself and the contribution. So again, thank you. That's all I can say is thank you.
Well, Fletch, I'd like to wrap up my part of this with this, and first, thank you for your kind words again. Uh, and I've spoken a lot about what I may have done, my role, uh, but please don't for 1 second think that this was a one man thing. There were hundreds of people on that bridge that day, all of them well meaning. There were hundreds of people in that subway that day. There were hundreds of people involved with the Beltway shooter, uh, and and to all of them, including those that have passed on, I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to have worked with them. And I want to say one last thing, and this is maybe a nice way to close this out. But it was mentioned earlier that uh, I had a pretty significant role in addressing the attack on the Pentagon in Arlington. And after after that event, and as I said earlier, I went on to Montgomery County. But nevertheless, I was asked to do an interview uh, near the Pentagon about the Pentagon, and the production company wasn't really sure about what location would be good. But I knew of a location that was on the shoulder of the George Washington Memorial Parkway, uh, as it passes just north of the cemetery. And so we met there, and he set up the tripods and the camera and the mics and all that stuff. And keep this in mind: we have off to my left, 1,000 yards, the 14th Street Bridge, where you could say an awful lot of this stuff got started. And off to my right, about 1,000 yards, you had the Pentagon building. In between those 2,000 yards were 19 years of history. And during that 19-year period, all of the things that we've talked about, these improvements, and we've just scratched the surface, occurred. So if you look at the events on the bridge and the chaos that it was, and then you look at the events at the Pentagon and the extraordinarily comprehensive, well managed, well equipped, well communicated, you name it, response to that event. In that 19 years of time, an awful lot of good stuff occurred, which really was brought to the fore on 9/11. And again, these are not necessarily improvements by people that put on a helmet and boots. These are people that are technologists, are visionary people, and so on. So to that whole crowd as well, because we are really one big family here. Thank you to them too, and I'm always proud of what occurred in that 19-year period. So, Fletch, thank you, sir.
Now, and as being someone who sat right next to you during one of your congressional testimonies, you always bring something to the table that isn't normally addressed at the table. And I'm thinking back to the day where you and Mr. Hank Hunt presented to the to Congress, and you had the gumption to make a 911 call before you went in and testify and prove to them that 911 didn't always work the way that it needed to work and that we needed to do something. And it's those moments that you just make a point so succinct, I just find incredible, and part of the Steve Souder that I know and love and respect as and I'm proud to call you my mentor.
Thank you, sir. God bless everyone.
You're the best, my friend. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for helping me preserve this information. And thank you to when you and I say thank you 911. I think it has a little different meaning. I like that a lot of people say that, but I think it's kind of like the term "I love you." It gets lost in the meaning sometimes. When you say it, when I say it, there's a lot of meaning behind it. So, thank you, 911.
Thank you.
Take care, Steve.